Welcome to the Hidden Truth. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and hit the bell so you never miss a secret. The rain fell in slow, heavy sheets over Dayton, Ohio, that November morning in 2008, soaking into the cracked asphalt of the factory parking lot where Sam, Brenner stood for a moment longer than he needed to, staring up at the enormous faded letters of the Delphi plant sign that had presided over his entire working life like a reluctant god. And even though the building loomed over him as solid and indifferent as ever, Sam knew something fundamental had changed, something irreversible. Because today was his last day after 41 years of service, 41 years of clocking in at 5:43 a.m. sharp, 41 years of welding frames, training new hires, memorizing safety codes, breaking his back for deadlines, breathing air that always smelled faintly of oil and dust no matter how many fans they installed, and he had given them everything: a young man's ambition, a middle-aged man's endurance, an old man's body held together with cortisone shots and willpower, and in return they had given him a retirement packet printed on cheap copier paper that said "Thank you for your dedication" in Times New Roman size 12 font, and a handshake from a shift supervisor half his age who had the decency at least to look embarrassed while doing it. And now Sam's life stretched out before him not as a golden field of relaxation but as a long, empty road marked by mortgage bills, second mortgages, credit card debt from paying for his wife's cancer treatments when the insurance wouldn't cover, experimental drugs, a 1989 Ford F-150 that coughed and rattled worse than he did on cold mornings, and a pension that had shriveled like a puddle under the blazing sun of corporate bankruptcy. And as he walked to his truck carrying a cardboard box of personal items, the bent-framed photo of his wife Marie from their honeymoon in Gatlinburg, the old lunch pail with the sticker that read, "Proud Union Brother," the small radio that had blasted out Merle Haggard songs during graveyard shifts, he felt a hollow thud of disbelief pounding inside his ribs, because deep down, some part of him had believed in the old deal: work hard, keep your head down, and America would take care of you when you couldn't take care of yourself anymore. But that deal, like so many others, had been quietly shredded in boardrooms and shareholder meetings while men like Sam kept their heads bent over conveyor belts and welding torches, too busy surviving to notice the foundation rotting beneath them. And now, driving home through the slow gray slop of late autumn rain, Sam tried to imagine what he was supposed to do with the endless afternoons that awaited him. And he realized with a bitter laugh that no one had ever taught him how to live without purpose, only how to endure, how to work, how to keep moving forward even when the world narrowed to a series of clock punches and overtime slips. And when he pulled into the cracked driveway of the small house he and Marie had bought in 1972 with a $500 down payment and a handshake deal from the local bank manager, the house where they raised their 2 boys, the house that now sat heavy with silence ever since Marie's passing 3 years earlier, he sat behind the wheel for a long time, watching the wipers struggle against the rain, feeling the weight of solitude settle on his shoulders like a second skin, and he thought about calling his sons, Eric, the oldest, who had moved to Charlotte to chase a sales career, and Danny, the younger, who taught high school history in Columbus. But the last few conversations had been strained, polite but distant, full of empty assurances about getting together soon, and Sam didn't want to hear the hesitation in their voices again, didn't want to be someone they visited out of obligation and left out of relief, and so he climbed out of the truck, the door groaning in protest, and went inside to the dim warmth of the house. Kicking off his boots and setting the box down on the kitchen table, and he stood there for a while, listening to the hum of the old refrigerator, the distant gurgle of the sump pump in the basement, the creak of the wind against the windows, and he realized he was more alone than he had been at any point in his life, not just in body but in spirit, stripped of the identity that had given shape to his days for 4 decades, and as the rain hammered down, he sat heavily in his chair by the window, staring out into the fading afternoon, wondering if this was all retirement meant now, waiting for bills to come, waiting for the roof to leak again, waiting for the phone not to ring. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a darker thought stirred. Maybe men like him weren't meant for retirement, maybe they were meant to keep working until their bodies gave out so they didn't have to face the hollow, echoing spaces left behind when the machine no longer needed them. And that night, after heating up a frozen dinner and watching reruns of MASH** until his eyes burned. Sam lay in bed listening to the rain slide down the gutters and made a silent vow that he wouldn't just sit and rot, that he would find some way to matter again, even if it was just fixing up the house, volunteering somewhere, finding a way to teach these kids today that the world wasn't always algorithms and 2-day shipping, that once you built things with your hands and your sweat and it mattered, even if it didn't anymore. And as he drifted into a restless sleep full of dreams of flashing weld sparks and endless time cards, he didn't know that the fight ahead wouldn't just be against loneliness or boredom, but against a system that had already decided he was obsolete, a fight that would test every ounce of grit he had left in a body already bowed by years of labor, a fight he would wage not for glory or even recognition, but simply because that's what men like Sam Brenner did. They fought. Even when nobody was watching, even when nobody cared. The snow came early that year, dusting the cracked streets of Dayton with a thin, brittle layer of white that turned gray by noon and black by sundown, and Sam Brenner, with nowhere he particularly needed to be, found himself walking the aisles of the local hardware store on a Tuesday morning, running his fingers absently along the smooth handles of tools he no longer needed for jobs he no longer had, and it struck him, somewhere between the aisle of pipe fittings and roofing nails, how the world seemed to have shifted when he wasn't looking, how once he had been the man fixing the furnace, patching the roof, replacing the alternator on Marie's old Buick. But now there were services for everything, apps and hotlines and shiny companies that promised convenience for a monthly fee, and he, a man who had built entire conveyor lines with nothing but schematics and a toolbox, was considered obsolete because he didn't have a smartphone to order someone else to do the work for him, and he thought about buying a hammer just to have a reason to stand there a little longer, but even that felt hollow, and so he left the store without buying anything, stepping into the cold air that bit at his knuckles and carried the faint, sour smell of the old paper mill across town that had been gutted and left to rot, another skeleton of the America he had grown up believing in. And as he drove home through neighborhoods where the houses sagged like tired shoulders and foreclosure signs multiplied faster than Christmas decorations, he wondered where all the promises had gone, the ones they used to teach in civics class, the ones men like his father had believed when they fought through Europe with Patton's Third Army, promises that if you worked hard, kept your nose clean, paid your taxes, stayed loyal, the country would take care of you in your final days. But now those promises seemed as antique as the black and white photos of GIs marching down Main Street in victory parades, and when Sam pulled into his driveway, he noticed for the first time how the paint was peeling from the window frames, how the shingles sagged like tired teeth along the edge of the roof, and he realized that maintenance, like pride, only lasted as long as you had the strength to carry it, and as he sat behind the wheel, the heating fan wheezing, he opened the latest letter from the bank and felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. Because despite his efforts to scrape by, despite cutting back on groceries, selling Marie's jewelry to pay off the utility arrears, skipping meals some days to stretch his pension checks, he was still falling behind on the second mortgage they had taken out in 1998 to cover her medical treatments. And now the letter said the bank would begin foreclosure proceedings if the balance wasn't paid within 60 days. And Sam, staring at the neat, cold language of financial execution, felt the kind of rage and despair that doesn't shout or break things but instead seeps into your bones, into the cracks left by years of compromise and disappointment, and he thought about calling Eric or Danny, explaining the situation, asking for help, but the pride that had sustained him through decades of layoffs and wage freezes and watching managers half his age make twice his salary refused to let him lift the phone, refused to let him risk hearing pity or, worse, obligation in their voices, and so instead he shuffled inside, laid the letter on the kitchen table next to the pile of unpaid bills, and sat down with a pad of paper to try to budget a way out. But no matter how he shifted the numbers, there just wasn't enough, and over the next few weeks he tried everything he could think of. He called the bank, pleaded for a restructuring, but the young man on the line, polite but detached, explained that, due to current economic conditions, the bank's hands were tied. He visited the local Veterans Service office, but they said his income was just high enough to disqualify him from emergency assistance. He even filled out an application to work part-time at a big-box home improvement store, only to be told after 2 interviews that they had gone with a candidate better suited to the role. And though no one said it outright, Sam could see it in their eyes. He was too old, too slow, too broken down for a world that valued speed and technology over steady hands and silent perseverance, and each rejection piled atop the last until he stopped trying, stopped leaving the house except for groceries and gas, and when the foreclosure notice arrived officially, delivered by a man who couldn't meet his eyes, Sam knew he had 2 choices: fight a system designed to grind him into dust, or find some way to slip through the cracks with his dignity intact. And so he made a plan, not a grand or cinematic plan, but the kind of plan a man makes when options have run dry. A plan that involved selling what little remained of value: the truck, the furniture, the old guns he had inherited from his grandfather, and moving into a 1-bedroom apartment on the rougher side of town where the rent was cheap and the neighbors kept to themselves. And he told himself it wasn't the end of the world, it was just another transition, another adjustment like the layoffs and the plant closures and the endless small betrayals he had endured over the years. And when Eric finally called, just days before Sam was set to move, asking about Thanksgiving plans, Sam didn't tell him about the foreclosure, didn't tell him about the boxes stacked in the hallway, didn't tell him about the ache in his chest that had nothing to do with clogged arteries and everything to do with seeing the sum total of a lifetime's work reduced to a pile of cardboard and memories. He just said, "No plans, son, you go ahead with your family," and hung up before his voice could crack. And as he spent his final night in the house packing the last of Marie's photo albums into a battered suitcase, he thought about how the world had changed without asking his permission, how the country he loved had shifted into something slicker, colder, more efficient but less human, and he wondered if maybe he had been a fool all along, believing that loyalty and hard work were enough, but deep down he knew he would have done it the same way again, because you don't build a life on cynicism, you build it on faith. Even if that faith is misplaced. And as he locked the door behind him for the last time and slipped the key through the mail slot for the bank to claim, Sam Brenner walked down the cracked sidewalk carrying the weight of 41 years not as a burden but as a badge, and though he didn't know what waited for him at the end of that road, he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he would meet it standing on his own 2 feet, the way he always had. The 1-bedroom apartment Sam Brenner moved into wasn't much more than a concrete shoebox perched above a strip of abandoned storefronts on the west side of Dayton, a part of the city where the paint peeled faster than it could be replaced and the weeds grew taller than the chain-link fences. But it was affordable, clean enough, and perhaps most importantly, anonymous. The kind of place where no one asked questions if you paid cash on time and kept your voice down after dark. And though Sam had lived most of his life in a house with a backyard, a garage, a kitchen big enough for Thanksgiving dinners, he forced himself not to dwell on what he had lost, because dwelling didn't put food on the table, and regret didn't pay the electric bill, and so he built a new routine out of necessity and stubbornness: coffee at dawn, a long walk through the cracked sidewalks and graffiti-tagged alleyways where the city's forgotten businesses sat like tombstones, a trip to the Goodwill store every Wednesday to search for used paperbacks and second-hand flannel shirts, a weekly visit to the public library where he could read the newspaper without paying for a subscription he couldn't afford, and a stop at the Veterans Outreach Center every Friday, where sometimes they offered free blood pressure checks and once in a while someone would slip him a voucher for a hot meal at the Baptist church down the street. And though Sam never asked for charity, he learned to accept small kindnesses with a nod of thanks and a silent promise to pay them forward if he ever got the chance. And as winter deepened and the wind turned crueler, Sam began volunteering a few hours a week at a local food pantry, stacking boxes, sweeping floors, doing the kind of quiet, necessary work that no one notices until it isn't done, and it gave him a sense of purpose, however small. Something to anchor the long empty hours between sunrise and sleep, and it was there, among the dented cans and faded faces of men and women who had also been chewed up and spit out by the relentless march of modern America, that Sam found a kind of kinship, a quiet brotherhood of survivors who understood without needing to speak that loss was not a failure but a tax on trying to live with dignity in a world increasingly hostile to the concept. And through this small circle, Sam began to hear stories that mirrored his own, men who had worked 30, 40 years only to watch their pensions evaporate in corporate bankruptcies, women who had raised families only to be priced out of the neighborhoods they helped build, soldiers who came home to find that the parades ended but the loneliness didn't, and it struck him again and again how little the country seemed to remember its promises, how easily it moved on to the next quarter's profits, the next election cycle, the next shiny distraction, while the backbone of its past rusted quietly in forgotten corners like Dayton's crumbling factory shells. And yet, despite it all, there was humor in the food pantry, small moments of rebellion against despair, jokes about the president, about the weather, about the futility of trying to keep mice out of the storeroom, laughter that crackled like firewood in a winter storm, and Sam, who had forgotten how good it felt to laugh without bitterness, began to carry those moments home with him, warming his tiny apartment with memories stronger than the thin baseboard heaters ever could. And it was during one of those Friday afternoons at the pantry, while unloading a truck of donated bread, that he met Rosa, a woman in her late 60s with steel-gray hair pulled into a no-nonsense braid, a laugh that filled the whole warehouse, and a gaze so steady it could pin a liar to the wall in 2 seconds flat. And Rosa, a widow whose husband had died of black lung after 30 years in the mines of West Virginia, recognized something in Sam, a kindred stubbornness, and she invited him one Sunday to a community potluck held at the local American Legion post, not out of pity but out of the simple understanding that no one should eat alone if they don't have to, and though Sam's first instinct was to decline, to retreat into the comfort of solitude, something in her smile, something real and unashamed, made him say yes, and that Sunday he found himself sitting at a long folding table covered in checkered plastic, surrounded by old veterans swapping lies about battles fought and battles avoided, retirees who could tell you exactly how many pills they took each morning, young families trying to stretch paychecks into next month's rent, and amid the clatter of paper plates and the smell of pot roast and overcooked green beans, Sam realized that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't been left behind entirely, that there were still places where a man's history mattered, where being steady and honest and simply showing up counted for something, and over time, Rosa and Sam grew close, not in the dramatic, whirlwind fashion of youthful romance, but in the slow, patient way that two people who have survived enough loss to understand what matters can find comfort in each other's company, and they began sharing Sunday dinners, walking to the farmer's market when the weather permitted, attending free concerts at the park where Sam learned that Rosa had a beautiful singing voice she almost never used in public, and he told her once, during a particularly golden evening on the porch of her small rented house, "You've got the kind of voice that could make a man believe again." And she laughed and said, "Believe in what?" And he shrugged and said, "Anything." And as spring returned to Dayton, and the days grew longer, and the air smelled less like defeat and more like rain and green things pushing up through the cracks, Sam felt something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Hope, fragile but real, and though the debts didn't vanish, though the aches in his joints didn't ease, though the future remained a narrow, uncertain road, he realized that survival wasn't just about breathing, it was about reaching out, about refusing to let the world convince you that your story had ended just because it had moved on without you. And so when a young volunteer at the pantry asked if he would be willing to tell his story for a community oral history project aimed at preserving the memories of the city's working-class backbone before they vanished entirely, Sam said yes, not because he wanted recognition, but because he understood, in the marrow of his bones, that the only thing worse than being forgotten was letting yourself believe you deserved it. By the time summer laid its heavy hand across Dayton, melting the sidewalks and painting the evenings with the low hum of cicadas, Sam Brenner had begun to feel a change stir inside himself, a shift so subtle he might have missed it if not for the way he noticed laughter coming easier, the way he caught himself humming under his breath while shelving canned goods at the food pantry, the way his walks to the library seemed to stretch longer. Not from burden but from an unspoken desire to stay out among people, among life. And it wasn't that the burdens had lifted. His bank account still bled a little more each month, his knees still screamed every time he climbed the stairs to his small, musty apartment, but it was that the weight seemed more bearable, shared somehow across the invisible threads of the small community he had found, the volunteers at the pantry, the veterans at the Legion Hall, Rosa with her endless supply of terrible coffee and warm smiles, and when the oral history project launched its first exhibit in a dusty corner of the downtown library, featuring black and white photographs of retirees standing proud in front of factories long shuttered and quotes handwritten on simple placards. Sam was there, standing awkwardly beside a photo of himself taken outside the pantry, one hand resting on a crate of green beans, his expression solemn but not broken, and when people stopped to read his words. Simple ones, honest ones. I gave them my strength. They gave me a pink slip. But I'm still standing. He watched their faces light up with something he couldn't name, a recognition maybe, or a shame, or a sudden fierce pride that someone had said aloud what too many had swallowed in silence. And that night, at the small potluck that followed the exhibit opening, the mayor, a well-meaning woman with kind eyes and callous political instincts, shook Sam's hand and thanked him for giving a voice to the backbone of this city. And though the words were polished and practiced, Sam appreciated the gesture, the way a man stranded on a road might appreciate a hand offering a drink even if it didn't offer a ride. And over the next few months, the project grew, spreading to other cities, other neighborhoods, other forgotten corners of the American map, and Sam's story traveled with it, sometimes distorted, sometimes abridged, but always carrying that core of stubborn truth that no amount of packaging could dilute. And letters began arriving at the food pantry, handwritten notes from strangers who saw their fathers in Sam's weathered face, who saw their grandmothers in Rosa's fierce gaze, and though Sam had never sought an audience, he answered every letter he could, sometimes with only a few lines scrawled in pencil, sometimes with pages of memories and reflections, because he understood, finally, that telling the story wasn't about vanity or pride, it was about survival. About refusing to let the world rewrite men like him out of the ledger of history. And one afternoon, while restocking shelves, Rosa brought him a letter postmarked from Charlotte, and he opened it with shaking hands to find a note from Eric, his oldest son, written in a stiff, careful hand that spoke more of duty than affection, apologizing for the long silence, congratulating Sam on everything you've done for the community, and promising to visit when things settled down at work. And Sam, reading the letter under the flickering fluorescent lights, felt the familiar ache of disappointment. But it didn't crush him this time, didn't send him spiraling into bitterness, because he realized he no longer needed their validation, no longer waited for calls that never came, and when he told Rosa about the letter, she squeezed his hand and said, "Sometimes the ones we wait for are the ones who stay stuck, not us." And he nodded, understanding at last that his life's worth wasn't measured by the number of visitors at his door, but by the number of people who carried his words into battles of their own. And as fall rolled in, crisp and golden, Sam's health began to falter more noticeably, the cough deepened, the walk to the library grew slower, the mornings grew heavier, but he faced it the way he faced everything, with a stubborn set to his jaw and a quiet refusal to pity himself. And when Rosa suggested he record his story, not just for the library project but for Abigail's new community archive being built online to preserve the oral histories for future generations, he agreed. Spending long hours sitting on Rosa's porch, speaking into a battered tape recorder about his childhood on a farm that no longer existed, his first day at the factory when men shook your hand and looked you in the eye, the day he met Marie at a county fair when the air smelled of popcorn and diesel, the pride he felt when Eric and Danny were born, the devastation he swallowed when Marie's diagnosis came, and the insurance company sent glossy brochures about affordable treatment alternatives, the slow erosion of everything he had believed in, and the fierce, stubborn decision to keep standing anyway. And when he finished, when the last tape clicked to a stop, Rosa hugged him tight and said, "Now they can't erase you." And Sam, blinking back the tears that came too easily these days, smiled and said, "I was never here to be erased." And that winter, as the city lit up in half-hearted Christmas lights and the food pantry served more meals than ever before, Sam spent his days sorting donations, writing letters, sitting with Rosa on the porch watching the twilight fall earlier each evening, and when the cough turned into pneumonia and the hospital stay loomed, he faced it the way he had faced every layoff, every betrayal, every empty mailbox, with a quiet, stubborn dignity that no debt collector, no absentee son, no corporate boardroom could touch. And when he finally slipped away one cold December night, with Rosa holding his hand and a battered army-issue blanket tucked Around his thin frame, he left behind not an estate, not a trust fund, not a marble tombstone, but something far more enduring, a story etched into the marrow of a community that refused to forget him, a testimony carried in the calloused hands of every man and woman who understood that worth isn't written in bank balances or accolades, but in the way you endure when the world stops seeing you, and at his memorial, held in the pantry warehouse among the shelves he had stocked with quiet pride. People gathered not to mourn a fallen hero, but to honor a man who had refused to fall, who had stood when standing no longer made sense, and when Rosa read aloud from the letter Sam had left for the occasion, a letter that ended simply, "Tell them I was here and I mattered," there wasn't a dry eye in the room, because they knew, in the deepest parts of themselves, that Sam Brenner had done more than matter. He had shown them what it meant to be truly, stubbornly, magnificently alive. In the months following Sam Brenner's passing, the little apartment above the boarded-up barber shop where he had spent his final years remained untouched, a relic suspended in time, the rent quietly paid for another 6 months by anonymous donations funneled through the food pantry's community fund, a collective gesture of respect for a man who had given so much without asking for anything back. And it was Rosa who eventually gathered the courage to climb the narrow, creaking stairs one gray March afternoon, key in hand, heart heavy, determined not to let the city's eviction officers sweep away the remnants of Sam's life like so much unwanted clutter, and inside, the air smelled faintly of old paper, coffee, and the lavender sachets Marie had once tucked into dresser drawers, and everything was as Sam had left it, the worn recliner facing the window, the battered coffee table stacked with library books overdue but forgiven, the corkboard above the kitchenette pinned with coupons, notes, and photographs of friends, of Rosa, of the ragged fellowship from the food pantry gatherings. And Rosa stood there a long moment, absorbing the silence, letting the weight of it settle into her bones before she began the delicate work of packing his life into boxes, not for storage or disposal but for preservation, because Sam Brenner, who had been forgotten by banks and corporations and absentee sons, would not be forgotten here, not by the people who understood what his story meant. And it was during this careful process that Rosa found the last hidden piece of Sam's legacy, a thick manila envelope labeled simply, "For them," containing a handwritten manuscript over 200 pages long, untitled but painstakingly organized, chronicling everything Sam had witnessed, the rise and fall of the factory floor, the tightening noose of medical debt, the quiet dignity of daily survival, and the slow, stubborn resistance of a man determined not to vanish, and with shaking hands. Rosa read the first page, tears blurring the words, and she knew immediately that this could not stay hidden, that Sam's voice needed to carry farther than the pantry, farther than Dayton, and so she reached out to Abigail, the young archivist who had first recorded Sam's oral histories, and together they spent nights typing, scanning, formatting, preserving every word, and when they were done, they published it online under the title still standing, The Life and Lessons of Sam Brenner, and to their astonishment, the story caught fire, not with viral memes or flashy headlines, but through word of mouth, through the quiet, relentless spread of something too raw and true to be ignored, and letters poured in again, thousands this time, from truck drivers in Nebraska, from retired teachers in Michigan, from factory workers in Pennsylvania who said, "He told my story too." And in small towns and forgotten suburbs, reading groups formed around Sam's book, community halls hosted evenings, where excerpts were read aloud, and local politicians, sensing something real in the movement, began quoting Sam's words in speeches about economic justice and the dignity of labor, and yet Rosa, ever protective of Sam's memory, made sure the story remained grounded, refusing offers from publishers who wanted to polish the narrative, to clean up the messy, painful truths Sam had written with such hard-won clarity. And when a documentary filmmaker came calling, Rosa agreed on one condition: that the project feature not just Sam's life, but the lives of countless others like him, those who had built the steel, the roads, the bridges, the homes, and then were cast aside when their hands grew too slow and their backs too bent, and so the documentary, titled Still Here, premiered in 2010 to modest fanfare but deep, lasting impact, winning awards not for its production values but for the undeniable force of its subject matter, and when it aired on PBS that winter, millions of viewers sat in living rooms across the country listening to Sam's voice, recorded on that battered tape recorder, talking about honor and loss and endurance, and many wept, not out of pity but out of recognition, and in the years that followed, Sam Brenner's name became a quiet symbol, not shouted from billboards or plastered across merchandise, but whispered in union halls, remembered in small acts of decency. Evoked whenever someone needed to explain why it mattered to show up, to speak up, to stand firm even when standing cost you everything, and Rosa, now herself growing older, took comfort in the knowledge that Sam's fight had not been in vain, that in a country too often obsessed with reinvention, there remained a space carved out by stubborn, honest remembrance, and when Jonah visited each year on the anniversary of Sam's death, bringing fresh flowers for the small memorial plaque installed at the food pantry. Simple words etched into bronze. Sam Brenner, worker, witness, warrior of quiet battles. He would sit with Rosa on the porch, sipping strong coffee and watching the sun dip behind the sagging skyline, and they would talk about Sam, not with the sad reverence reserved for saints, but with the affectionate teasing reserved for stubborn old men who had refused to die small. And when Jonah's son, little Sam, born in 2012 and named for the grandfather he would never meet, asked one afternoon, "Was Grandpa a hero?" Jonah smiled and said, "He was more than a hero, kiddo, he was real." And though little Sam didn't understand the weight of those words yet, he carried them with him, and someday, Rosa knew, he would, because stories like Sam's didn't end with a funeral, or a plaque or a best-selling book. They lived on in the calloused hands fixing a broken fence, in the tired eyes voting in a forgotten election, in the quiet refusal to give up even when giving up would be easier, and so Sam Brenner's true memorial wasn't in any monument or headline, but in every man and woman who read his story and remembered that worth is not bestowed by the powerful but claimed by the enduring, and in every small, defiant act of standing tall when the world tried to make you kneel. By the time a full decade had passed since Sam Brenner's death, the city of Dayton had changed in ways he might have recognized and ways he would not have, as old factories were razed to make way for hollow condominiums few could afford. Downtown storefronts flickered between abandonment and half-hearted revitalization, and new generations grew up without ever hearing the clang of a working assembly line. But on the west side, in the sturdy red brick building that once housed the food pantry, where Sam spent his last working hours stacking cans and sweeping floors, a new community center thrived, its walls lined not with corporate slogans but with photographs of men and women whose names weren't famous but whose lives had built the very streets people now walked on, and at the center of the largest wall, hung at eye level, was a simple, powerful image, Sam, in his threadbare flannel jacket, standing beside Rosa on the front steps of the pantry, smiling a tired but defiant smile that seemed to dare the world to forget what they had stood for, and below the photo, in plain block letters, the words Sam had once scribbled in a dusty corner of his journal. "They can take what you have. They can forget your name. But they cannot erase your living." And every year, on the anniversary of Sam's passing, a small crowd gathered, not massive, not televised, but real, veterans in battered jackets, retired teachers, nurses, factory men with hands still strong despite the years, young activists carrying not anger but reverence, and children who recited Sam's words from a battered paperback edition of Still Standing that had become required reading in several local high schools. And at each gathering, stories were shared, small personal accounts of endurance, resilience, survival, and inevitably, the newest generation would ask about him, about the man whose life seemed so improbably large and the echoes he left behind, and Rosa, now in her 80s but still sharp as ever, would lean forward from her seat near the front and tell them the truth, the way Sam would have wanted it, not polished, not grandiose, but raw and real. How he had worked until his hands cracked and his back bent, how he had loved and lost without bitterness, how he had been knocked down again and again by a system that promised loyalty in exchange for obedience and delivered neither, and how he had stood anyway, stubborn, unbending, his very existence a defiant act of memory in a world addicted to forgetting. And each year, more people came, not because Sam was a saint, not because he had been perfect, he hadn't, but because he had lived honestly, had refused to let his mistakes define him, or his defeats silence him, and that was rarer, more precious, than any fleeting fame, and 1 year, on the 20th anniversary of his death, a group of young volunteers planted a garden in the vacant lot across from the center, a stubborn patch of tomatoes, beans, sunflowers, and wildflowers, dedicated to the working hands who built our tomorrow. And they named it Brenner's Field, and as seasons turned and generations shifted, Sam's name lived on, not through grand memorials but through small acts of everyday courage. A laid-off machinist returning to school at 50, a young mother organizing a union drive at a distribution center, a retired nurse speaking truth to a town hall about the dignity of care, each of them carrying forward a shard of the stubborn, irreplaceable spirit Sam had embodied, and Jonah, who had watched all this unfold with a mixture of pride and sorrow, often wondered what his father would have thought of the ripples he had left behind, and he liked to believe that Sam, had he seen it, would have nodded once, maybe smiled that crooked smile, said something gruff like, "Not bad for an old fool," and gone right back to work, because for Sam, and for those like him, the work was never about glory or recognition. It was about standing, about enduring, about building something that lasted beyond your own time. And as Jonah sat on the porch of the center one warm evening, watching little Sam, now a teenager taller than Jonah himself, explain to a group of wide-eyed kids why it mattered to know who came before them, he realized that Sam's legacy was not carved in marble or archived in museums but lived, breathed, and grew in the lives he had touched. And in that moment, as the sun dipped low over Dayton's battered skyline, casting everything in a fierce, stubborn gold, Jonah understood finally and fully what his father had spent a lifetime trying to teach without ever saying aloud. That you don't measure a man's worth by what he leaves behind in things, but by what he leaves behind in people, and that as long as someone remembers, someone cares, someone stands a little taller because they knew your story, you are never truly gone. And so Sam Brenner remained, not a footnote, not a casualty, but a foundation, a stubborn, weathered cornerstone in the long, unfinished building of a country still trying, still striving, still standing. Thank you for being with us on The Hidden Truth. If you enjoyed this, leave a like, drop a comment, and be sure to subscribe. The secrets are waiting to be revealed. See you soon.